December 5, 1945. The war was over, the skies felt safer, and 5 Navy aircraft lifted off from Florida on what should have been a routine training flight. The United States stood at a rare moment of collective exhale. World War II had ended just 4 months earlier. Cities were no longer darkened by blackout orders. Factories that had once produced bombers and torpedoes were shifting back toward civilian life. Millions of servicemen were returning home, carrying stories of distant oceans and foreign skies, but also carrying the belief that the most dangerous chapter was behind them. Aviation, in particular, was entering a new age of confidence. During the war, pilots had crossed the Atlantic in combat conditions, navigated without modern electronics, and landed aircraft on rolling carrier decks in darkness and storms. By late 1945, flight itself felt mastered. The sky had been charted, trained for, and conquered. What remained was refinement, practice, instruction, and preparation for a peacetime military that still required discipline and readiness. On that afternoon, at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida, nothing about the weather, the schedule, or the mood suggested danger. The base was accustomed to the sound of engines starting and fading into the distance. Training missions launched daily. Crews boarded aircraft with checklists memorized, procedures drilled, and expectations firmly grounded in routine. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers taxied into position. Each was a large, rugged aircraft designed for war, capable of long-range flight, heavy payloads, and sustained operations over open water. They had flown in combat across the Pacific and the Atlantic. They were not experimental machines, they were proven. The mission assigned to these 5 planes carried no sense of urgency or risk. It was a standard navigation exercise, one that had been flown many times before by other students. The goal was simple: practice dead reckoning navigation over water, simulate a bombing run, and return to base. The route was familiar. The instructors trusted it, the Navy trusted it. The flight was designated Flight 19. Each aircraft carried a crew of 3, a pilot, a gunner, and a radio man, though the training configuration focused primarily on the student pilots and their instructor. 14 men in total boarded the 5 planes. Most were young. Some had wartime experience. All had passed the standards required by the U.S. Navy. None were assigned to this flight because of recklessness or exceptional risk tolerance. They were there because the mission was considered safe. Shortly after 2 p.m., the 5 Avengers lifted off from Fort Lauderdale and headed east, out over the Atlantic Ocean. They were expected back before nightfall. They never returned. At first, there was no alarm. Training flights occasionally ran long. Minor delays were common. Radio chatter could fade in and out as aircraft moved farther from shore. No one at the base immediately assumed anything was wrong. But as time passed and the expected return window closed, concern began to replace routine patience. Then came the radio transmissions. Confusion, disagreement, uncertainty. The pilots began reporting that their compasses were not behaving as expected. The instructor expressed concern that they could not identify their position. The flight believed, incorrectly, that they were somewhere over the Florida Keys, hundreds of miles south of where they should have been. The assumption drove decisions. The decisions drove the aircraft farther from safety. As daylight faded, the radio signals weakened. Weather conditions deteriorated. Fuel levels dropped. Control towers attempted to guide the planes back, but the guidance relied on the pilot's own understanding of where they were, and that understanding was already fractured. Then the voices stopped. No distress call was received, no mayday was clearly recorded, no final coordinates were confirmed. The Atlantic swallowed the radio silence without explanation. 5 aircraft, 14 men, gone. But the story did not end there. Within hours, the U.S. Navy launched a rescue operation.
Among the aircraft sent to search for Flight 19 was a PBM Mariner flying boat, a large, long-range patrol and rescue aircraft designed specifically for ocean search and rescue. It carried 13 crew members. Its mission was to find the missing pilots before fuel exhaustion and darkness turned confusion into catastrophe. That rescue aircraft also vanished. Witnesses along the coast reported seeing an explosion in the sky. An oil slick was later observed on the water, but no wreckage was conclusively recovered. The rescue plane never returned. 13 more men were added to the list of the missing. In a single afternoon and evening, 27 U.S. Navy personnel disappeared. No enemy action had occurred. No combat zone existed. No official emergency had been anticipated. Yet by nightfall, 2 separate Navy flights were gone without trace. The scale of the loss was unprecedented for a peacetime training mission. The shock rippled through Naval Command, through aviation communities, and eventually through the American public. Newspapers struggled to explain how such a disappearance could happen in familiar waters so close to the continental United States. The ocean east of Florida was not uncharted. Shipping lanes crossed it daily. Naval patrols were frequent. Weather systems were monitored. And yet, somewhere between routine and catastrophe, the flight path of Flight 19 dissolved into uncertainty. The question was immediate and unavoidable. How could 5 aircraft, flying together, communicating with each other, under instruction, simply lose their way? How could a rescue aircraft, dispatched with urgency and purpose, vanish as well? And how could the most powerful navy in the world conduct the largest search in its history and find nothing definitive in return? What began as a standard navigation exercise became one of the most enduring aviation mysteries of the 20th century. Over time, the absence of answers would invite speculation, exaggeration, and myth. But beneath every later theory lays a foundation of documented facts, radio logs, weather reports, and investigative conclusions. Facts that tell a story not of the supernatural, but of human limits, environmental danger, and the unforgiving nature of open water. Flight 19 did not vanish into legend on December 5, 1945. It vanished into history. And before myth, before mystery, before cultural distortion, there were men, trained, confident, and unaware that the sky they trusted would not bring them home. This is the story of what happened next.
The disappearance of Flight 19 occurred at a precise moment in American history, when confidence was high and doubt felt unnecessary. The Second World War had ended with decisive force. The United States emerged not only victorious, but technologically dominant, militarily expansive, and psychologically convinced that preparation and innovation had reduced the unknowns of the modern world. By December of 1945, the nation was transitioning rapidly from wartime urgency to peacetime structure. Military bases across the country were still active, but their purpose was changing. Combat operations had ceased, yet training continued. The Navy, in particular, understood that aviation would remain central to future defense. Pilots still needed to be trained, navigation still needed to be practiced, discipline still needed to be enforced. What had changed was the mindset. During the war, mistakes were expected under pressure. Losses occurred in hostile skies, under enemy fire, or in poorly charted regions of the globe. When aircraft went missing during wartime, the assumption of danger was immediate and clear. Combat explained absence. In late 1945, that framework no longer applied. The waters off the coast of Florida were not considered dangerous. They were familiar. Naval patrols had operated there throughout the war. Commercial shipping moved through the region constantly. Weather patterns were studied. Coastlines were mapped. This was home territory. More importantly, American aviation culture had been reshaped by success. Thousands of pilots had been trained rapidly during the war. Procedures were standardized. Aircraft were mass-produced. Navigation techniques such as dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed, time, and direction, were drilled into every student. These methods were not theoretical. They had carried pilots across oceans and back again. As a result, there was a widespread belief that aviation risk had been largely solved, not eliminated, but controlled. Training accidents still occurred, but they were usually explainable. Mechanical failure, pilot error, weather intrusion. Each had a cause that fit within known parameters. Investigations identified errors, procedures were refined, and confidence moved forward intact. Flight 19 would challenge that entire assumption. In December 1945, the U.S. Navy was operating one of the largest aviation training programs in the world. Young pilots, many of whom had entered service too late to see combat, were being prepared for long-term careers. They trained alongside veterans who had flown combat missions, creating a layered environment of experience and instruction. The instructors were trusted, the aircraft were trusted, the routes were trusted. This trust was not casual optimism, it was built on statistical success. Tens of thousands of training flights had been conducted without incident. Navigation exercises identical to Flight 19's mission had been flown repeatedly from the same base, over the same water, using the same procedures. The idea that multiple aircraft could simply disappear during such a mission was incompatible with the Navy's understanding of its own systems. That incompatibility would drive the shock that followed. When Flight 19 failed to return on time, the initial reaction reflected this confidence. Delays were assumed to be minor. Radio issues were assumed to be temporary. No immediate emergency signal had been received, and the absence of a Mayday call reinforced the belief that the situation was recoverable. As time passed, however, and radio transmissions revealed confusion rather than clarity, a deeper anxiety emerged. Navigation failure was not supposed to happen this way. Dead reckoning, while imperfect, was reliable when practiced by trained pilots. Compass failure was possible, but redundancy existed. Visual cues, coastlines, islands, cloud formations were expected to provide confirmation. Even if one aircraft encountered an issue, the presence of 4 others offered cross-verification. The American military mindset of late 1945 did not account for cascading uncertainty. It assumed that errors could be isolated. Flight 19 demonstrated how quickly isolation could collapse. The disappearance struck at a moment when the nation was redefining its relationship with risk. Wartime danger was externalized: enemies, battlefields, foreign skies. In peacetime, danger was expected to be manageable, procedural, and internal. Flight 19 did not fit that model. There was no enemy. There was no mechanical failure conclusively identified. There was no storm of record violent enough to explain immediate destruction. Instead, there was confusion, gradual, documented, and unresolved. The Navy understood the implications immediately. If a routine training mission could unravel without clear cause, then confidence itself became a liability. Every assumption about navigational certainty, instructor authority, and procedural safety required re-examination. This is why the response to Flight 19 was swift and expansive. The Navy did not treat the disappearance as a localized incident. It treated it as a systemic threat to aviation reliability. If Flight 19 could vanish, then any training mission could be vulnerable under the wrong combination of circumstances. The post-war period was supposed to be an era of stability. Instead, Flight 19 introduced an unsettling reminder. The ocean had not changed, the sky had not softened, and technology had not erased human limitation. The confidence that followed World War II was real, but it was also fragile. It rested on the belief that systems worked because they had worked before. When those systems failed without immediate explanation, the shock extended beyond the loss of aircraft. It challenged the narrative of control. In the weeks and months following the disappearance, newspapers framed the event as an anomaly, something extraordinary and rare. But within the Navy, the framing was more sober. An anomaly demanded explanation, not because it was strange, but because it exposed vulnerability.
Flight 19 was not just a tragedy, it was a warning that peacetime skies could still claim lives, that familiarity bred assumptions, that even experienced pilots operating within known environments could become disoriented, misled, and ultimately lost. This context is essential to understanding why the disappearance resonated so deeply. It occurred at the intersection of victory and vulnerability, at a moment when the nation believed it had mastered the tools that had once terrified it. Flight 19 reminded America that mastery was not immunity, and it set the stage for a deeper examination, not only of what happened on December 5, 1945, but of how a routine mission, built on confidence and repetition, could unravel with such devastating finality. To understand that unraveling, it is necessary to understand exactly what Flight 19 was, not as a legend, but as a structured naval operation designed for predictability. That examination begins with the aircraft, the mission, and the assumptions built into both.
Flight 19 was not an experimental operation, nor was it an improvised mission assembled under unusual circumstances. It was a clearly defined naval training exercise embedded within a standardized program that had been refined through years of wartime necessity and post-war continuity. Everything about it, from the aircraft assigned to the route selected, reflected institutional familiarity rather than risk. The 5 aircraft that composed Flight 19 were TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, designated by the U.S. Navy as long-range, single-engine aircraft capable of sustained over-water flight. During World War II, Avengers had become a cornerstone of naval aviation. They flew anti-submarine patrols, torpedo runs, and reconnaissance missions across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. By late 1945, they were among the most widely used and trusted aircraft in the Navy's inventory. Each TBM Avenger was large, stable, and designed with redundancy in mind. The aircraft featured robust navigation instruments, including magnetic compasses and gyro compasses, as well as radio equipment for communication with other aircraft and ground stations. They carried sufficient fuel for extended operations and were built to withstand harsh maritime conditions. In training configurations, they were commonly flown by a single pilot, with additional crew members serving observational or instructional roles. Flight 19 consisted of 5 such aircraft, each operating under the same mission parameters. The group was led by a designated flight instructor, whose responsibility was to guide the student pilots through the exercise and ensure safe execution of navigational procedures. The presence of an instructor reflected standard Navy practice and underscored the assumption that the mission required supervision rather than improvisation. The purpose of the flight was navigational training, specifically dead reckoning navigation over water. Dead reckoning relied on calculating an aircraft's position based on heading, speed, elapsed time, and known wind conditions. While it lacked the precision of later electronic navigation systems, it was a fundamental skill for pilots operating beyond visual landmarks. During the war, it had carried aviators across vast expanses of ocean with sufficient accuracy to complete combat missions. The training syllabus required student pilots to practice this skill repeatedly under varying conditions until it became second nature. The route assigned to Flight 19 was chosen precisely because it provided a controlled environment for this practice. It included a simulated bombing run, directional changes, and a return leg designed to reinforce positional awareness. The aircraft departed as a unit, maintaining visual and radio contact. They were not intended to operate independently. The structure of the flight assumed coordination, shared situational awareness, and instructor oversight at all times. Crucially, there was nothing about Flight 19 that suggested elevated difficulty. The route was not new, the weather forecast did not predict severe conditions, the aircraft were not nearing maintenance limits, the crews were not fatigued from extended operations. In the Navy's classification system, this was a routine training flight.
The instructor assigned to lead Flight 19 was considered experienced. He had logged significant flight hours and was familiar with both the aircraft type and the training area. His role was not merely to complete the exercise, but to correct errors as they arose, reinforcing proper technique among the student pilots. The students themselves were not novices. While some were relatively young, they had already completed basic flight training and advanced instruction. They were flying the Avenger because they had demonstrated competence. None were assigned to the mission as a test of endurance or decision-making under stress. The exercise was designed to simulate normal operating conditions, not emergencies. This distinction matters because it shaped expectations at every level of command. When Flight 19 failed to return, there was no immediate suspicion that the mission itself had been flawed. The assumption was that some external factor had intervened, weather, equipment malfunction, or miscommunication. The idea that the structure of the flight, as designed, could collapse without a singular catastrophic event was difficult to accept. The Avengers carried radios capable of maintaining contact with each other and with ground stations. While radio reliability over water could vary, the presence of multiple aircraft increased the likelihood that at least one transmission would remain clear. This redundancy was part of the Navy's safety framework. Flight 19 was also equipped with emergency procedures. If an aircraft encountered serious trouble, standard protocol called for distress signals and position reporting. Ditching at sea, while dangerous, was survivable under certain conditions, and rescue planning accounted for such scenarios. None of these safeguards produced clarity on December 5, 1945. What makes Flight 19 particularly significant is not that an aircraft disappeared, but that a coordinated group operating under instruction failed as a system. The very features designed to prevent loss, redundancy, communication, and oversight became points of confusion rather than resolution. As the mission progressed, the instructor's authority, the students' trust in instruments, and the collective understanding of position began to diverge. When that divergence occurred, the flight ceased to function as a unified entity, even though the aircraft remained physically together for much of the time. This was not a failure of technology in isolation. It was a failure of interpretation. The Avengers' instruments did not vanish. The radios did not instantly go silent. The aircraft did not disintegrate in midair. Instead, the flight entered a state where available information could no longer be reconciled into a coherent picture of reality. From the Navy's perspective, this was deeply troubling. Training missions were designed precisely to prevent such breakdowns. If pilots could not trust their instruments, their instructor, or their assumptions simultaneously, then the margin between routine and disaster was thinner than believed. Flight 19 exposed that margin. Understanding what Flight 19 was, a structured, familiar, well-equipped training exercise, is essential to understanding why its disappearance was so destabilizing. It was not a fringe operation. It was a reflection of standard practice. And when standard practice failed, the consequences rippled outward, forcing a re-examination of how the Navy trained its aviators and how much confidence could safely be placed in routine. To fully grasp the human cost of that failure, it is necessary to look beyond the aircraft and the mission and toward the men who flew them. Individuals whose lives, experiences, and expectations were bound to a flight that never came home.
Behind the designation Flight 19 were 14 individual lives, each shaped by a world at war and a future that had only just begun to open. The disappearance of the flight was not an abstract loss of equipment or a statistical anomaly within naval records. It was the sudden erasure of men who had families, histories, and identities grounded firmly in reality. The pilots and crew assigned to Flight 19 represented a cross-section of post-war American naval aviation. Most were in their early to mid-20s. Some had enlisted while the war was still raging. Others had entered service late enough that their training extended into the immediate post-war period. All had passed the Navy's standards for flight duty, which were neither casual nor lenient. None of the men assigned to the mission were disciplinary problems. None were placed on the flight as a test of punishment or remediation. Their presence together reflected normal scheduling, not selective risk-taking. The flight was led by an instructor pilot whose role carried particular weight. As an instructor, he was responsible not only for his own aircraft, but for the decisions and learning outcomes of the students under his supervision. The Navy did not assign this role lightly. Instructors were expected to demonstrate confidence, clarity, and decisiveness, especially when student pilots encountered uncertainty. The students themselves were not inexperienced beginners. They had completed primary and advanced flight training and had already accumulated flight hours sufficient to operate complex aircraft. They understood navigation theory, instrument interpretation, and emergency procedures. They were in training not because they lacked competence, but because naval aviation demanded repetition under controlled conditions. Several of the men had wartime exposure, though not all had seen combat. For those who had, Flight 19 represented a transition away from survival-driven missions and toward professional refinement. For those who had not, it was preparation for a future Navy still defining its post-war role. Families waiting at home had little reason for concern. Training flights were common, and accidents, while tragic, were statistically rare. There was no sense that this particular mission carried heightened danger. Loved ones expected delays at most, not disappearance. This normalcy is essential to understanding the shock that followed. When the flight failed to return, families were not immediately notified. The Navy followed procedure, which prioritized confirmation before alarm. But as hours passed and the search intensified, the reality of loss began to take shape without the clarity of explanation. For the men of Flight 19, there would be no recovery of remains, no confirmed crash site, no definitive narrative of final moments. Their absence became the defining fact. The lack of physical evidence complicated grief. Families were left suspended between hope and resignation, a psychological state common to disappearances but rare in military aviation losses, where wreckage or battle reports usually provided closure. The men were officially listed as missing, a designation that acknowledged uncertainty rather than resolution. Over time, that status would shift to presumed dead, but the transition did not bring answers. From the Navy's perspective, the qualifications of the crew deepened the mystery. Investigators found no record of recklessness, intoxication, or insubordination. Training evaluations did not suggest systemic incompetence. Medical records revealed no conditions that would explain collective disorientation or impaired judgment. This absence of personal fault mattered. When disasters occur, institutions often look for individual error as a point of explanation and correction. In the case of Flight 19, no such anchor existed. The men involved were trained, capable, and operating within expected parameters. The instructor's role would later receive particular scrutiny, not as an accusation, but as an unavoidable focal point. Leadership in aviation is decisive, especially in training environments. When confusion arises, students look to the instructor for resolution. If the instructor himself is uncertain, that uncertainty can propagate rapidly. But even this dynamic did not suggest negligence. Instructors were human, subject to the same limitations as their students. The Navy's training model assumed that experience reduced risk, not eliminated it. The men of Flight 19 were also bound by the era in which they flew. Navigation in 1945 relied heavily on interpretation rather than automation. Compasses were mechanical. Wind estimates were calculated rather than digitally measured. Visual landmarks mattered, and over open water, those landmarks were scarce. These realities placed a cognitive burden on pilots, especially when instruments disagreed with expectations. The ability to reconcile conflicting information was a learned skill,
and even experienced aviators could be challenged by ambiguity. The human dimension of Flight 19 is not one of dramatic heroism or reckless error. It is one of ordinary professionalism confronted by extraordinary uncertainty. Each man boarded his aircraft with the expectation of returning to base. They conducted pre-flight checks, reviewed procedures, and followed orders. There was no indication that anyone anticipated danger or felt unease. This is why Flight 19 resonated so deeply within the Navy and beyond. The men who vanished did not fit the profile of those typically lost to avoidable error. Their disappearance could not be comfortably attributed to incompetence or defiance. They were, by every available measure, the kind of aviators the Navy relied upon to build its future. Their loss exposed a painful truth. Training and experience reduce risk, but they do not guarantee safety. Systems built on human judgment remain vulnerable to moments when judgment is undermined by incomplete or misleading information. For the families, this truth offered little solace. The absence of a body or wreckage meant the absence of certainty. Letters stopped arriving, promotions went unrealized, lives continued elsewhere, while theirs remained frozen on a December afternoon. Flight 19 became more than a missing mission. It became a shared void, carried by those who waited for news that never came. Understanding the men of Flight 19 means recognizing that this mystery is not defined by myth or speculation, but by the sudden interruption of ordinary lives. The investigation that followed would seek technical explanations, but it would also carry the weight of human expectation unfulfilled. To understand how those lives intersected with failure, it is necessary to examine the structure that guided them, the training plan itself, and the assumptions embedded within its design.
The training plan assigned to Flight 19 was not designed to test endurance, improvisation, or crisis management. It was designed to reinforce familiarity. Every element of the route reflected repetition, predictability, and confidence built through routine execution. The Navy selected this specific exercise precisely because it was considered reliable. Flight 19 was scheduled to depart from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in the early afternoon, a time chosen to maximize daylight and minimize weather uncertainty. Afternoon training flights were common, visibility was typically strong, and instructors favored daylight conditions for navigation exercises involving student pilots. The first leg of the mission was straightforward. After takeoff, the 5 TBM Avengers were to fly east over the Atlantic Ocean for approximately 56 nautical miles. This initial leg served as a transition from land-based visual navigation to open-water dead reckoning. Pilots were expected to establish heading, airspeed, and time calculations once coastal landmarks disappeared behind them. At the end of this eastward leg lay the designated practice bombing area near Hen and Chicken Shoals. This shallow water region had been used repeatedly for training. It provided a clear point of reference for navigation exercises and allowed pilots to practice simulated bombing runs without live ordnance. The area's location was well documented, and its coordinates were included in training materials. Upon reaching the shoals, the pilots were to perform a simulated bombing exercise. This portion of the mission was not complex. It required maintaining altitude, aligning approach vectors, and timing the simulated release point. The purpose was not combat realism, but procedural discipline. Once the bombing run was completed, the flight was instructed to turn north. This second leg was longer and served to test the pilot's ability to maintain heading and calculate position over extended distances. After flying north for a set period, the final instruction was simple: turn west and return to base. The westward leg should have brought the aircraft back toward the Florida coastline. As the planes approached land, visual cues such as shoreline shape, watercolor changes, and familiar landmarks would confirm successful navigation. This three-legged pattern, east, north, west, was intentionally simple. It minimized variables. It had been flown many times before by other training flights. Instructors trusted it because it allowed student pilots to practice navigation without introducing unnecessary complexity. The route was documented. The headings were calculated. Fuel requirements were known. Each aircraft carried more than enough fuel to complete the exercise with a safety margin. The Navy did not consider this mission hazardous. The training plan assumed several things as givens. It assumed that compasses would function within acceptable tolerance. It assumed that winds would not deviate significantly from forecasts. It assumed that instructors would be able to identify when students made minor errors and correct them early. Most importantly, it assumed that at some point during the return leg, visual confirmation of land would resolve any lingering uncertainty. This assumption was foundational. Overwater navigation training relied on the idea that dead reckoning errors accumulated gradually, not catastrophically. Small deviations could be corrected once land was sighted. The training plan was not designed to account for a scenario in which pilots fundamentally misidentified their location. The structure of Flight 19 also assumed group cohesion. The 5 aircraft were expected to remain within visual range of each other. If one pilot encountered uncertainty, the instructor could assess the situation collectively. Group flying reduced individual error by allowing shared observation and consensus. This was standard practice. It had worked reliably. The training plan did not include contingency routes for complete navigational uncertainty. Emergency procedures existed for mechanical failure, fuel issues, or weather deterioration, but the assumption was that navigational errors would be partial and recoverable. In hindsight, this reveals a critical vulnerability. The plan depended on layered confidence. Confidence in instruments, confidence in calculations, confidence in visual cues, and confidence in leadership. If one layer weakened, the others were expected to compensate. But the plan did not anticipate the simultaneous erosion of multiple layers. Flight 19 was not prepared for ambiguity without anchors. The decision to conduct the mission over open water was deliberate. The Navy believed that controlled exposure to featureless environments was necessary for pilot development, but that exposure also removed the margin of error provided by terrain recognition. Over the Atlantic, the sky and sea often appear uniform. Cloud formations can obscure sun position. Watercolor can vary unpredictably. Without land, orientation relies heavily on instruments and mental models. The training plan trusted those models. The timing of the mission further reinforced confidence. Afternoon conditions allowed pilots to use the sun as a directional reference. The expectation was that even if compasses behaved erratically, celestial cues could assist orientation. This assumption was based on experience, not theory. However, celestial navigation at low altitudes and in changing weather conditions was imperfect. Cloud cover could obscure the sun. Glare off the water could distort perception. These factors were known but considered manageable. The training plan did not include explicit instruction for scenarios in which multiple navigational cues contradicted one another. This omission was not negligence. It reflected prevailing aviation philosophy. Training emphasized correction, not paralysis. Pilots were taught to trust procedures and authority when uncertainty arose. In Flight 19's case, the authority structure would become strained when the instructor himself began expressing doubt about position. The plan also assumed effective communication. Radio contact with base and between aircraft was considered sufficient to resolve confusion. Ground controllers could provide guidance if needed, but only if the pilots could accurately describe their perceived location. This reliance on self-reported location created a feedback loop. If pilots misidentified where they were, external guidance could reinforce the error rather than correct it. The training plan did not include mechanisms for independent verification of position beyond what pilots could observe and calculate. This limitation was inherent to the technology of the time. In practice, the plan worked because pilots rarely lost confidence simultaneously. Someone would recognize a landmark. Someone would notice a calculation error. The system relied on human intervention to stabilize itself. Flight 19 would demonstrate what happened when stabilization failed.
As the mission progressed, the very simplicity of the route became a liability. When expectations did not match observation, confusion intensified rather than resolved. The pilots expected to see land when turning west. When they did not, the assumption shifted from error to mislocation. Believing they were over the Keys rather than east of Florida fundamentally altered decision-making. A westward turn from the Keys would lead deeper into the Gulf of Mexico, not to safety. The training plan assumed correct initial orientation. Once that orientation was wrong, every subsequent decision compounded the error. This is why the plan matters so deeply to understanding Flight 19's disappearance. It was not flawed in isolation, it was flawed in context, dependent on assumptions that failed under specific conditions. The Navy would later scrutinize this plan, not to assign blame, but to identify systemic vulnerability. How could a routine exercise allow misinterpretation to escalate without correction? How could 5 aircraft follow a structured route and yet diverge so completely from expectation? The answers would not lie in reckless design or careless planning. They would lie in the intersection of human cognition, environmental ambiguity, and procedural rigidity. Flight 19 followed the training plan as long as the plan matched reality. When reality diverged, the plan offered no escape. Understanding that moment of divergence requires examining not just the structure of the route, but the precise instant when navigation began to fail, when instruments, perception, and authority no longer aligned. That failure did not occur suddenly. It unfolded gradually through small uncertainties that accumulated into irreversible disorientation. The next stage of the story begins at that point, when routine navigation gave way to doubt and the sky over the Atlantic stopped offering answers.
The failure of Flight 19's navigation did not announce itself with a single catastrophic event. It emerged quietly, through uncertainty that at first seemed manageable and familiar to trained pilots. Navigation errors were not unusual in aviation. What distinguished this moment was not the presence of confusion, but its persistence and escalation despite multiple opportunities for correction. The first indications of trouble appeared after the completion of the simulated bombing run near Hen and Chickens Shoals. Up to that point, the mission had progressed according to plan. The aircraft had reached the practice area, executed the required maneuver, and prepared for the northward leg of the route. Nothing in the initial phase suggested imminent danger. It was during this transition that the instructor began to express concern over navigational instruments. Radio transcripts later reviewed by investigators recorded reports that the compasses in the aircraft were behaving unpredictably. Pilots described readings that did not align with expected headings. The instructor communicated that his compass appeared to be malfunctioning and that he was uncertain of the group's precise location. Compass discrepancies were not unheard of, especially in aircraft exposed to magnetic interference or mechanical wear. Standard procedure in such cases was to cross-check readings with other instruments, verify headings against elapsed time and airspeed, and compare observations across multiple aircraft. Flight 19 attempted these corrections. However, the compasses across the flight did not offer a clear consensus. Some pilots believed their instruments were functioning correctly, others were unsure. The instructor's uncertainty carried disproportionate weight, as his role was to resolve disagreement rather than contribute to it. As the flight continued, the instructor reported a belief that they were flying over the Florida Keys. This conclusion became a pivotal moment in the flight's fate. The Florida Keys lay far to the south of the planned route. If the flight were indeed over the Keys, then the Atlantic coast of Florida would be north and east, not west. Acting on this assumption, the instructor reasoned that flying north or east would bring them closer to land, while flying west could take them farther out to sea. This belief, though incorrect, was not irrational in isolation.
Over open water without visible land, positional errors could occur. Cloud cover and uniform seascape could obscure reference points. The instructor's concern was grounded in a desire to avoid moving farther away from safety. What made this moment critical was the absence of independent verification. Several student pilots questioned the conclusion. Radio transmissions recorded them expressing uncertainty about the key's identification and suggesting alternative headings. Some believed that the flight was actually east of Florida, where a westward turn would lead back to land. This disagreement introduced a fracture in group cohesion. In training environments, instructors are expected to resolve such disputes decisively, but decisiveness relies on confidence, and confidence relies on reliable information. In this case, the instructor lacked confirmation that his assumption was correct, yet the structure of authority placed his judgment at the center of decision-making. As the debate continued, time passed. Fuel was being consumed. Daylight was diminishing. Weather conditions began to change. What had been clear skies earlier in the afternoon gave way to increasing cloud cover and deteriorating visibility. The worsening weather compounded navigational difficulty. Without consistent sunlight, celestial orientation became unreliable. Without visible land or distinct cloud formations, visual cues offered little assistance. The flight became increasingly dependent on instruments and calculations already under question. Radio contact with ground stations was maintained intermittently. Controllers attempted to determine the flight's position based on reported headings and estimated distances. However, these efforts depended on accurate self-reporting. If the flight misidentified its location, ground guidance would necessarily be compromised. At one point, ground controllers suggested headings designed to bring the aircraft west toward Florida. The instructor hesitated, expressing concern that flying west might lead them deeper into the Gulf of Mexico if they were indeed over the Keys. This hesitation was not rooted in defiance. It reflected the genuine fear of making the wrong choice in an environment where every direction appeared uncertain. The failure of navigation at this stage was as much psychological as technical. Pilots are trained to make decisions under uncertainty, but prolonged ambiguity erodes confidence. When uncertainty persists, decision-making can become conservative in ways that paradoxically increase risk. The instructor's reluctance to commit to a westward heading delayed the corrective action that might have resolved the situation earlier. Meanwhile, student pilots continued to express concern. Their transmissions reflected growing anxiety, not panic, but recognition that the situation was deteriorating. They were aware of fuel limitations. They were aware that daylight was fading. They were aware that disagreement was unresolved. The radio transcripts show a gradual shift in tone from procedural to worried. This shift is critical. It marks the moment that the flight moved from routine training into emergent crisis. Despite this, no distress signal was issued. At no point did the flight declare an emergency in the formal sense. This absence would later complicate search and rescue efforts, as no final confirmed position or emergency status was recorded. The absence of a Mayday call suggests that the pilots believed the situation was still recoverable. This belief, while understandable, proved fatal. Navigation failure in aviation is rarely about a single instrument malfunction. It is about the accumulation of small errors and the inability to reconcile conflicting data. In Flight 19's case, compass uncertainty, misidentified location, and authority conflict combined into a feedback loop that reinforced incorrect assumptions. Once the instructor believed they were over the Keys, evidence was interpreted to support that belief. The lack of visible land was attributed to weather or distance rather than mislocation. Compass discrepancies were seen as confirmation of instrument unreliability rather than positional error. This cognitive trap is well documented in aviation psychology. When a pilot commits to an incorrect mental model, contradictory information is often discounted rather than integrated. Flight 19 became trapped in such a model. As time passed, the opportunity for simple correction narrowed. A decisive westward turn earlier in the flight might have revealed the Florida coastline before fuel became critical. Delays increased the distance traveled in the wrong direction, making recovery more difficult. The weather continued to worsen. Wind speeds increased, affecting ground speed calculations. Rain squalls reduced visibility further. The sea below became indistinguishable from the sky at the horizon, eliminating one of the few remaining visual references. The navigation failure was now total. Radio contact weakened as the aircraft moved farther from shore. Transmissions became sporadic. Ground controllers struggled to maintain communication and provide effective guidance. At this point, the flight was no longer simply lost, it was isolated. The significance of this phase cannot be overstated. Flight 19 did not vanish abruptly. It unraveled through a series of reasonable decisions made under faulty assumptions. Each decision narrowed the margin for error until none remained. This is why the disappearance has resisted simple explanation. There was no moment when disaster became inevitable in a dramatic sense. Instead, inevitability emerged quietly through cumulative misjudgment and environmental constraint. By the time the instructor made the decision to fly west, believing it might bring them closer to land, fuel levels were already dangerously low. The correction, if correct, came too late. The last transmissions reflected an awareness of fuel exhaustion approaching. The pilots discussed ditching if necessary, a procedure which, while survivable under certain conditions, was perilous in worsening weather and darkness. Then the radios fell silent. Navigation failure had done its work. What remained was the ocean, the sky, and a group of aircraft whose precise fate would never be directly observed. To understand the final moments of Flight 19, it is necessary to examine the radio communications in detail, the voices that documented confusion, hesitation, and fading hope in real time before disappearing entirely.
The radio communications of Flight 19 form the most detailed and haunting record of what unfolded on December 5, 1945. Unlike wreckage or physical evidence, which was never conclusively recovered, the voices transmitted through Navy frequencies provide a chronological window into confusion becoming crisis. These transmissions were not reconstructed after the fact. They were recorded, logged, and preserved as part of standard naval procedure. They reveal not panic, but erosion. At first, the radio traffic sounded routine. Pilots reported headings, acknowledged instructions, and confirmed positions in the clipped, professional language expected of training flights. The tone was calm. The assumption of control remained intact. That tone began to shift as the instructor voiced uncertainty about navigation. Early transmissions referenced compass issues. The instructor reported that his compass readings were inconsistent, that they did not match expected headings. This alone did not indicate disaster. Compass discrepancies were manageable when identified early. Pilots were trained to cross-check instruments, verify calculations, and rely on visual cues. But soon, the transmissions reflected something more troubling: disagreement. Student pilots began questioning the instructor's assessment of their location. Some expressed doubt that they were over the Florida Keys. Others suggested alternative interpretations of compass readings and headings. These were not insubordinate challenges. They were procedural concerns raised within the framework of training. The radio logs show pilots attempting to reconcile conflicting information collaboratively. This moment marked a critical shift. Training flights were designed to reinforce instructor authority, not debate it. When multiple pilots express uncertainty simultaneously, the instructor is expected to resolve ambiguity quickly. That resolution did not occur. Instead, the radio traffic grew denser and more fragmented.
Ground stations monitoring the transmissions began to recognize that the flight was experiencing navigational difficulty. Controllers attempted to assist by requesting positional information and suggesting headings that would guide the aircraft back toward the Florida coast. These instructions depended on one key factor: accurate self-reporting. Flight 19 could not provide that accuracy. When asked for position, the pilots could only describe what they believed they were seeing: open water, cloud cover, and no recognizable landmarks. The assumption that they were over the Keys persisted in the instructor's mind, shaping his responses to ground guidance. As a result, when ground controllers advised flying west, the instructor hesitated. He expressed concern that such a heading might take them farther from land rather than closer to it. This hesitation is documented in the transcripts. The radio communications at this stage reveal a fundamental problem. Ground control and the flight were operating from incompatible mental maps. Controllers believed the flight was east of Florida. The instructor believed they were south of Florida. Each set of instructions made sense within its own framework, but the frameworks did not align. As daylight waned, radio signal quality degraded. Atmospheric conditions, distance from shore, and equipment limitations all contributed to intermittent contact. Transmissions were sometimes faint, sometimes partially cut off, sometimes overlapping. This degradation amplified confusion. Instructions had to be repeated. Clarifications took longer. The margin for misunderstanding widened. The radio logs also record growing concern about fuel. Pilots began discussing remaining fuel levels openly. This was not unusual in extended flights, but the context made it ominous. Fuel calculations were now estimates layered on top of uncertain position and uncertain heading. The instructor acknowledged that fuel was becoming critical. He began discussing the possibility of ditching, intentionally landing the aircraft on water if land could not be reached in time. Ditching procedures were part of training. Pilots were instructed on how to execute them, how to prepare the aircraft, and how to increase survivability. However, ditching was considered a last resort, particularly in rough seas and fading light. The radio communications indicate that the pilots did not believe ditching was imminent at first. They discussed it as a contingency, not an inevitability. This suggests that even at this late stage, they believed recovery was still possible. No formal distress call was made. This absence has been the subject of later speculation, but the transcripts themselves offer explanation. The pilots were communicating regularly. They were receiving guidance. They were actively attempting to resolve the situation. In their assessment, they were lost but not yet doomed. A Mayday call would have signaled immediate danger and triggered different procedures. The pilots did not appear to believe they had crossed that threshold. As weather conditions worsened, radio contact became increasingly sporadic. Rain squalls and cloud cover interfered with both navigation and communication. The ocean below was no longer calm, and visibility declined sharply. Eventually, the instructor made a decision to fly west. This decision is recorded in the transcripts and marks a final attempt at correction. Whether the decision was based on new information or the exhaustion of alternatives is unclear, but it represented a commitment to a single course of action after prolonged uncertainty. By the time this decision was communicated, fuel margins were minimal. The last known transmissions from Flight 19 were fragmented. Pilots acknowledged instructions, reported worsening conditions, and expressed awareness of fuel exhaustion approaching. There is no record of panic, shouting, or emotional breakdown. The tone remained professional, even as options disappeared. Then the transmissions stopped. The silence was not immediate or dramatic. It followed a gradual weakening of signal strength. Ground controllers attempted to re-establish contact repeatedly, calling the flight by designation, requesting acknowledgement, offering headings. No response came. The radio logs end not with a final statement, but with absence. This silence marked the moment when Flight 19 ceased to exist as a communicative entity.
Whatever happened afterward occurred beyond observation, beyond recording, and beyond confirmation. For investigators, the radio communications became the primary evidence. They showed that the aircraft did not explode mid-air during the training mission. They did not encounter sudden catastrophic failure. They did not descend into chaos without warning. They became lost. This distinction matters because it anchors the disappearance in documented human experience rather than mystery. The voices captured on radio frequencies reveal a chain of decisions shaped by incomplete information, environmental ambiguity, and institutional structure. The radio logs also dispel later exaggerations. There were no reports of strange lights, sudden compass spinning, or supernatural phenomena in the official transcripts. There was confusion, disagreement, and uncertainty, all within the bounds of known aviation challenges. The tragedy of Flight 19 lies not in the unknown, but in the known that could not be reconciled in time. The radio logs preserve the last moments when intervention was possible. They capture the narrowing of options and the quiet professionalism of men attempting to solve a problem without realizing how little margin remained. When contact was lost, the responsibility shifted entirely to those on the ground. The Navy understood that time was now the enemy. Fuel exhaustion, darkness, and weather meant that survival, if any aircraft had ditched, would be measured in hours. The disappearance of Flight 19 was no longer a navigational problem. It was a rescue emergency. And that emergency would soon deepen as the Navy launched an urgent search that would claim even more lives before the night was over.
By the time Flight 19 reached its final known phase, the margin for recovery had narrowed to almost nothing. What remained was not a dramatic climax, but a slow constriction of options, shaped by fuel exhaustion, failing light, and weather that steadily erased the last advantages of training and experience. The last confirmed radio communications place Flight 19 in a state of constrained decision-making rather than chaos. The pilots were still flying, engines were still running, control had not been lost. What had been lost was certainty. Fuel calculations, once precise, had become estimates. The aircraft had been airborne far longer than planned. Every additional minute in the air reduced the number of remaining choices. The pilots were acutely aware of this reality, and their transmissions reflected it. The instructor acknowledged that fuel was becoming critical across the flight. This acknowledgement was not an expression of panic, it was procedural. Fuel status reporting was standard practice, especially when delays occurred. But in this context, it marked a transition from navigational concern to survival calculus. As daylight faded, visual navigation became nearly impossible. The horizon blurred, cloud cover thickened. The distinction between sea and sky dissolved into uniform darkness broken only by shifting weather patterns. For pilots trained to rely on both instruments and sight, this environment was deeply disorienting. Instrument flight was possible, but it depended on trust. Trust in compasses already questioned, trust in calculations already undermined, and trust in assumptions that had failed repeatedly throughout the afternoon. The final decision to fly west was communicated as a last corrective measure. It represented an attempt to simplify the problem, choose one direction and commit, rather than continue debating alternatives. This choice was consistent with aviation doctrine under uncertainty, but timing was decisive. By the time the westward heading was adopted, the flight had likely traveled far beyond the distance where a simple correction could guarantee landfall before fuel exhaustion. Weather conditions continued to worsen. Rain squalls reduced visibility to near zero. Turbulence increased. Winds altered ground speed unpredictably, making dead reckoning calculations even less reliable. Each aircraft experienced these conditions slightly differently, further eroding cohesion. Radio contact weakened further. Transmissions became brief and intermittent. Some aircraft were heard more clearly than others, suggesting variations in distance, altitude, or equipment performance.
The final known transmissions indicate that the pilots understood what was coming. They discussed ditching, not as a hypothetical, but as a real possibility. This discussion was practical rather than emotional. Ditching procedures were reviewed, preparations were implied. Ditching a TBM Avenger at sea was dangerous but not automatically fatal. The aircraft was designed to allow controlled water landings under certain conditions. Crews were trained to approach parallel to wave direction, reduce speed, and brace for impact. Survival depended on sea state, visibility, and rescue response. On December 5, 1945, those variables were unfavorable. Night was approaching or had already fallen. The sea was roughening under deteriorating weather. Even a successful ditching would leave crews exposed in open water, reliant on life rafts and signaling equipment with rescue uncertain. No final mayday was recorded. This absence does not imply indifference or denial. It reflects the reality that the pilots were already communicating continuously. They did not perceive a single catastrophic moment requiring escalation. Instead, they faced a gradual loss of options. The last confirmed contact did not include coordinates. It did not declare an imminent ditching. It did not include emotional farewells or dramatic statements. It ended mid-problem. After that point, there are no verified records of Flight 19's movements. No radar tracking existed that could provide further insight. No visual sightings were confirmed. No debris was reported immediately. What likely followed can only be inferred within the bounds of documented aviation outcomes, not dramatized speculation. Fuel exhaustion would have forced each aircraft to descend. The timing would not have been simultaneous. Differences in fuel consumption, engine performance, and decision-making would have caused staggered outcomes. Some aircraft may have ditched earlier, others may have remained airborne slightly longer. The lack of debris does not contradict ditching scenarios. Aircraft that ditch intact can sink rapidly, especially if structural damage occurs on impact. The Atlantic in that region is deep and currents are strong. Floating wreckage can disperse quickly or sink before detection. The absence of distress signals after the final transmissions suggests that events unfolded quickly once fuel was depleted. In darkness and poor weather, opportunities to coordinate ditching or maintain radio contact would have been minimal. The final known moments of Flight 19 are therefore defined not by a single event, but by disappearance into conditions that erase evidence efficiently. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. There was no confirmed crash site, no explosion heard, no wreckage field to analyze. The aircraft did not announce their end. They simply ceased to exist within the observable record. For the Navy, this absence created an investigative vacuum. Without physical evidence, conclusions would rely heavily on radio logs, weather data, and navigational analysis. Each source offered partial insight, but no definitive resolution. The silence following the last transmissions triggered immediate escalation. Search and rescue procedures were activated without delay. Naval Command understood that survival, if any crew had ditched successfully, depended on rapid response. Time was measured not in days, but in hours. The Atlantic at night is unforgiving. Exposure, dehydration, and hypothermia can overwhelm even trained personnel quickly. The probability of survival diminished with each passing minute. The disappearance of Flight 19 at this stage was not yet a mystery in the public sense. It was an emergency. The Navy's focus was on recovery, not explanation. That focus would soon expand dramatically. Within hours of the final radio contact, the Navy launched one of the largest search operations in its history. Aircraft and ships were mobilized. Coast Guard units were alerted. The effort was immediate and extensive. But before the search could even fully unfold, tragedy would compound tragedy. A rescue mission sent to find Flight 19 would itself vanish into the same night, adding 13 more men to the list of the missing and deepening the shock that rippled outward from the Atlantic. The final known moments of Flight 19 thus form a hinge point in the story. They mark the transition from the navigational failure to irreversible loss, from uncertainty to absence. What followed would challenge the Navy's confidence not only in aviation safety, but in the assumption that rapid response could always bring answers. The ocean would offer none, and the sky, which had carried Flight 19 outward in routine confidence, would not return them. The next chapter begins not with discovery, but with another disappearance, one that transformed an urgent rescue into an even larger mystery.
The disappearance of Flight 19 triggered an immediate shift within the U.S. Navy from routine monitoring to full emergency response. The loss of radio contact, combined with the deteriorating weather and fuel concerns recorded in the final transmissions, left no ambiguity about the seriousness of the situation. Whatever confusion had defined the earlier hours was replaced by urgency. The Navy understood what was at stake. If any of the aircraft of Flight 19 had ditched successfully, the survival window for the crews would be narrow. Exposure in open water, especially as night fell and weather worsened, could prove fatal within hours. The Atlantic east of Florida was not a forgiving environment, and time was the enemy. Search and rescue operations began even before Flight 19 was officially declared lost. Among the aircraft dispatched was a PBM Mariner flyboat, a large, twin-engined patrol aircraft specifically designed for long-range over-water missions. The Mariner was not a training aircraft. It was built for exactly this kind of operation, searching vast ocean expanses, landing on water if necessary, and carrying sufficient crew and equipment for extended missions. The Mariner assigned to the search carried a crew of 13 men. Its departure was routine, its purpose clear. The crew understood the risks inherent in night flying and rough weather, but these risks were part of naval aviation. Rescue missions often launched under imperfect conditions because waiting could cost lives. The Mariner lifted off into the same darkening sky that had swallowed Flight 19. Shortly after takeoff, something went catastrophically wrong. Witnesses along the Florida coast later reported seeing a sudden explosion in the sky. Some described a bright flash followed by flames. Others recalled the sound of an impact or detonation. These accounts were not uniform in detail, but they were consistent in essence. An aircraft had exploded in midair. Around the same time, ships operating in the search area reported observing an oil slick on the surface of the ocean. The PBM Mariner never returned to base. No radio distress call was received from the aircraft. No Mayday transmission was recorded. The disappearance was abrupt and decisive, in stark contrast to the gradual unraveling of Flight 19. 13 more men were now missing. The loss of the rescue aircraft transformed the situation from a tragic mystery into a compounded disaster. The Navy was no longer searching for one flight. It was now confronting the disappearance of two separate aircraft under different circumstances, connected only by time, location, and the unforgiving conditions of the Atlantic. Unlike Flight 19, the fate of the Mariner was not clouded by navigational uncertainty. The aircraft did not report confusion, fuel issues, or loss of orientation. Its disappearance was sudden, violent, and final. Investigators would later focus on the Mariner's design and operational history to understand what might have happened. The PBM Mariner had a known reputation within naval aviation. While it was a capable long-range patrol aircraft, it also carried a troubling nickname among crews. The aircraft's fuel system and ventilation design made it vulnerable to vapor buildup under certain conditions.
If fuel vapors accumulated and ignited, the resulting explosion could be catastrophic. This vulnerability was not theoretical. Several mariners had been lost in similar incidents before December 1945. The Navy was aware of the risk, and crews were trained to manage it, but the danger could not be eliminated entirely. The weather conditions that night likely exacerbated the risk. Rough air, turbulence, and rapid altitude changes could increase stress on fuel systems. Night operations reduced visual awareness of developing problems. A sudden ignition could occur without warning. The witness reports of an explosion align with this known hazard. The oil slick observed shortly afterward further supports the conclusion that the mariner was destroyed in midair and impacted the ocean in fragments. Unlike a controlled ditching, such an event would leave little recoverable wreckage. Despite this, the Navy conducted a search for the mariner as well. Ships and aircraft were redirected to the reported explosion area. The ocean was scanned for debris, survivors, or identifiable remains. Nothing definitive was recovered. The loss of the rescue aircraft introduced a cruel irony into the unfolding tragedy. A mission launched to save lives itself ended in sudden death. 13 men who had departed with the purpose of recovery became victims of the same environment they sought to confront. This second disappearance also had a profound psychological impact within Naval Command. Search and rescue operations rely on the assumption that risk is justified by potential reward. When a rescue mission itself becomes fatal without achieving its objective, that assumption is shaken. Commanders were forced to weigh the urgency of recovery against the increasing danger posed by weather and darkness. Nevertheless, the search did not stop. If anything, the loss of the mariner intensified the Navy's resolve. The scale of the disaster now demanded action not only for survival, but for accountability. The nation could not accept the disappearance of 27 servicemen without exhaustive effort. The public, however, did not immediately know the full scope of what had occurred. Early reports focused on Flight 19. The loss of the rescue aircraft emerged later, adding a second layer of shock. Newspapers struggled to convey the unfolding events accurately. Information arrived in fragments, much like the radio transmissions that preceded the disappearances. Speculation began to circulate almost immediately, fueled by the lack of concrete answers. Within the Navy, the focus remained procedural. The disappearance of the mariner was treated as a separate incident, investigated on its own merits. While it occurred during the Flight 19 search, its cause was not assumed to be related to navigational error or environmental anomaly beyond known hazards. This distinction is critical. Later narratives would link the two losses into a single mysterious event, implying a shared cause beyond coincidence. Official records do not support that conclusion. The mariner's loss, while tragic, aligns with documented mechanical vulnerabilities and eyewitness accounts of explosion. Flight 19's disappearance, by contrast, left no such immediate explanation. The two events were connected by proximity and timing, but not necessarily by mechanism. Together, however, they created an unprecedented situation. In a single evening, the Navy lost 2 aircraft and 27 men without a confirmed recovery site. The cumulative effect was devastating. The Atlantic that night had taken more lives than anticipated, and it had done so in ways that resisted immediate understanding. As search operations expanded, the Navy faced an uncomfortable truth. Even with extensive resources, modern aircraft, and experienced crews, the ocean could still erase evidence completely. The loss of the rescue aircraft reinforced this lesson brutally. If a large patrol plane could vanish after an apparent explosion without leaving recoverable wreckage, then the chances of locating 5 smaller aircraft that had likely ditched in rough seas were even slimmer. Yet the Navy persisted. The following days would see one of the largest coordinated search efforts in naval history. Hundreds of aircraft and ships would scour thousands of square miles of ocean and coastline. The effort would reflect both technological capability and institutional determination. But the loss of the rescue aircraft marked a turning point. It underscored that the search itself carried lethal risk. It reminded everyone involved that the Atlantic did not distinguish between those in distress and those attempting to help. Flight 19 had vanished into uncertainty. The rescue mission had vanished into fire, and the Navy now faced a dual obligation: to search relentlessly for answers and to confront the possibility that none might be found. The next chapter of this story is defined not by disappearance, but by effort, by the massive, methodical search that followed, and by what it revealed not only about the ocean, but about the limits of even the most determined human response.
The disappearance of Flight 19, followed by the loss of the PBM Mariner rescue aircraft, triggered a response unprecedented in scale for a peacetime naval operation. What began as a localized emergency rapidly expanded into one of the largest coordinated search efforts the U.S. Navy had ever undertaken. The absence of confirmed crash sites, distress signals, or debris transformed urgency into exhaustive determination. Within hours, Naval Command mobilized every available resource. Aircraft were dispatched from multiple bases along the Florida coast. Surface vessels, including destroyers, patrol craft, and Coast Guard cutters, were ordered into the Atlantic. Commercial ships transiting the region were alerted and instructed to report any sightings of debris, oil slicks, or survivors. The search area expanded quickly as estimates of Flight 19's possible location widened. Without a confirmed last position, planners were forced to rely on projected flight paths, fuel endurance calculations, and radio transmission ranges. Each variable introduced uncertainty, and the overlapping uncertainties produced an enormous search grid. At its peak, the operation involved hundreds of aircraft and ships. Naval and Coast Guard aircraft flew systematic search patterns, sweeping designated sectors of ocean and coastline. Pilots flew low and slow to maximize visibility, scanning the surface for signs of wreckage or life rafts. Observers strained to distinguish between natural debris and potential evidence, often under difficult weather conditions. Surface vessels crisscrossed the search area, maintaining radio contact with aircraft overhead. Lookouts were posted around the clock. Searchlights were deployed at night. Crews were instructed to investigate any anomaly, no matter how small. The logistical complexity of the search was immense. Aircraft required refueling, maintenance, and crew rotation. Ships had to coordinate movements to avoid duplication while ensuring coverage. Communication between units had to be constant and precise. Despite these efforts, the ocean offered little cooperation. Weather conditions fluctuated throughout the search period. While some days brought improved visibility, others were marked by rough seas, high winds, and intermittent storms. Each change altered drift patterns, complicating predictions about where debris or survivors might be found. The Atlantic's currents played a critical role. Strong, shifting currents in the region could carry floating objects far from their origin in a short time. This meant that even if aircraft or rafts had surfaced briefly, they could have been dispersed beyond the initial search grid. The search also extended along the coastline. Beaches were patrolled on foot. Local authorities and volunteers were instructed to report any unusual findings. Reports of debris were investigated promptly, though most proved unrelated. Throughout the operation, no confirmed wreckage from Flight 19 was recovered. This absence strained both resources and morale. Search crews were trained to endure long operations, but the lack of tangible progress weighed heavily. Each day that passed without discovery reduced the likelihood of finding survivors.
The disappearance of the PBM Mariner added another layer of complexity. Search planners had to account for two separate incidents with potentially different locations and causes. Witness reports of the Mariner's explosion provided a narrower focus area for that aircraft, but even there, recovery proved elusive. An oil slick believed to be associated with the Mariner was observed, but oil slicks were not uncommon in busy shipping lanes. Without identifiable debris, confirmation remained uncertain. The Navy's determination to continue the search was driven not only by hope of rescue, but responsibility. The loss of 27 servicemen demanded exhaustive effort. Ending the search prematurely would have been unacceptable, both institutionally and morally. As days passed, the operation transitioned from rescue to recovery in practical terms, though it was never formally labeled as such. Survival estimates were revised downward based on exposure models and environmental conditions, yet the search continued. The scale of the effort attracted public attention. Newspapers published maps showing the vast area being searched. Radio broadcasts updated listeners on developments, though information was limited by the absence of findings. Speculation began to fill the void left by facts. Within the Navy, the lack of evidence prompted careful documentation. Every sighting, every report, every deviation from expected conditions was logged. Investigators understood that even negative findings, the absence of debris, carried information. The search operation revealed a sobering reality. Even with overwhelming resources, the ocean could conceal events completely. The Navy's technological advantage, so decisive during the war, was less effective against the sheer scale and depth of the Atlantic. This realization forced a reassessment of assumptions. The idea that aircraft losses could always be explained and recovered was no longer tenable. Flight 19 and the Mariner demonstrated that disappearance itself was a possible outcome, even in familiar waters. After several days, with no survivors found and no definitive wreckage recovered, the Navy faced the painful decision to scale back active search operations. Resources were gradually withdrawn. Patrols continued, but the intensity diminished. The decision was not framed as abandonment, but as acknowledgement of reality. The probability of rescue had dropped to near zero. Continued large-scale operations would expose additional crews to risk without reasonable expectation of success. The men of Flight 19 and the Mariner were officially listed as missing, later presumed dead. For families, the end of the search marked a transition from hope to mourning without closure. There would be no recovery missions, no funerals with remains, no physical evidence to anchor grief. For the Navy, the search left unanswered questions that demanded investigation. How could such an extensive operation yield nothing definitive? What factors had combined to erase both aircraft and evidence so completely? These questions would drive formal inquiry. The search itself became part of the legacy of Flight 19. It demonstrated both the reach and the limits of organized response. It showed what could be mobilized in the face of uncertainty and what could still remain hidden despite that mobilization. The Atlantic had not yielded its secrets. In the absence of wreckage, the Navy turned to analysis. Investigators examined weather records, navigation procedures, radio transcripts, and training protocols. The goal was not only to understand what happened, but to prevent recurrence. The disappearance of Flight 19 was no longer an active emergency. It had become a case, and that case would be scrutinized in detail, its findings shaping both official conclusions and public perception for decades to come. The next chapter examines how the Navy approached that task, the investigation, the conclusions drawn, and the reasons why, even after exhaustive review, the final cause would remain officially unresolved.
When the active search for Flight 19 and the missing PBM Mariner was finally scaled back, the U.S. Navy faced a different kind of obligation. Rescue efforts had yielded no survivors and no definitive wreckage. What remained was the responsibility to understand how a routine training mission and a subsequent rescue flight could disappear without conclusive physical evidence. The investigation that followed was methodical, restrained, and grounded in documented facts rather than conjecture. The Navy approached the inquiry with an awareness of its broader implications. This was not merely an effort to explain a single tragedy. The findings would influence training doctrine, navigation standards, and institutional confidence in naval aviation. Any conclusion had to be defensible, supported by evidence, and free from sensational interpretation. The investigative process began with the consolidation of all available records. Radio transcripts formed the backbone of the inquiry. Every recorded transmission from Flight 19 was reviewed, analyzed, and placed into chronological context. Investigators paid particular attention to changes in tone, content, and decision-making. These communications provided the clearest insight into the flight's mental state and operational challenges. Weather data was examined next. Meteorological records from December 5, 1945 showed that while conditions were not extreme at the outset of the mission, they deteriorated significantly as the afternoon progressed. Increasing cloud cover, shifting winds, and rain squalls were consistent with the difficulties reported by the pilots. The weather was not unprecedented, but it was sufficient to complicate navigation and reduce visual cues. Navigation procedures were scrutinized closely. Investigators reconstructed the intended flight path and compared it to the reported headings and assumptions expressed in the radio communications. This reconstruction highlighted the central issue, a misidentification of position that influenced every subsequent decision. The belief that the flight was over the Florida Keys rather than east of Florida emerged as a critical error. Once this assumption took hold, ground controllers' corrective guidance was filtered through an incorrect mental model. Westward headings that would have led to safety were perceived as dangerous. Eastward or northward movements that increased distance from land were viewed as corrective. This misinterpretation was not attributed to recklessness. It was understood as a cognitive error exacerbated by environmental ambiguity. Investigators also examined the aircraft themselves. Maintenance records for the TBM Avengers showed no evidence of systemic mechanical failure. Compass irregularities were considered plausible, particularly given known issues with magnetic variation in the region and potential instrument error. However, no conclusive evidence suggested a catastrophic equipment malfunction affecting all 5 aircraft simultaneously. Fuel capacity and consumption rates were calculated carefully. Based on known endurance limits, the aircraft would have exhausted fuel within a predictable window after the last radio contact. This analysis supported the conclusion that fuel exhaustion was inevitable, given the duration and direction of flight. The absence of a distress call was examined in detail. Investigators concluded that the lack of a mayday signal did not indicate complacency or denial. Rather, it reflected the pilot's belief that they remained in control of the situation until the final phase. Continuous communication, ongoing decision-making, and gradual deterioration did not align with the sudden emergencies typically associated with distress declarations. The investigation also addressed the loss of the PBM Mariner separately. Witness reports of an explosion, combined with the aircraft's known vulnerability to fuel vapor ignition, concluded investigators that the rescue aircraft was likely destroyed by an onboard explosion shortly after takeoff. This conclusion was supported by prior incidents involving the same aircraft type. Importantly, the Navy did not find evidence linking the Mariner's loss to the navigational issues that affected Flight 19. The 2 incidents occurred within the same operational context, but were attributed to different causes. As the investigation progressed, internal debate emerged regarding how to characterize responsibility. Early drafts of the report reflected an inclination to assign fault to human error, specifically the instructor's decisions.
This approach, however, raised concerns. Assigning individual blame risked oversimplifying a complex situation. The instructor's actions were evaluated within the constraints he faced: uncertain instruments, deteriorating weather, conflicting information, and the responsibility of leading multiple student pilots. Investigators recognized that focusing solely on individual error would obscure systemic vulnerabilities. These concerns influenced revisions to the report. The final conclusions emphasized contributing factors rather than singular causes. Navigation error was identified as a likely element, but it was framed as a result of misinterpretation rather than incompetence. Weather was acknowledged as a complicating factor, though not the sole cause. Instrument reliability was considered, but not deemed conclusively responsible. The Navy ultimately listed the cause of Flight 19's disappearance as unknown. This designation has often been misunderstood. It did not imply mystery in the sensational sense. It reflected the absence of definitive physical evidence that could confirm a specific sequence of events beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation could identify probable factors, but it could not verify them conclusively. In institutional terms, unknown was a responsible conclusion. It acknowledged uncertainty without inventing explanations. It avoided blaming without proof. It preserved the integrity of the investigative process. The findings did not end with classification. Recommendations were issued to improve training in navigation procedures. Greater emphasis was placed on cross-verification of position, especially when instructors expressed uncertainty. Communication protocols were reviewed to encourage earlier declaration of emergency status when confusion persisted. Instrument checks and redundancy awareness were reinforced. These changes reflected lessons learned rather than admissions of failure. Public reaction to the investigation was mixed. Some accepted the conclusions as a sober acknowledgement of aviation risk. Others were dissatisfied by the lack of definitive answers. The designation of unknown left room for speculation, especially among those unfamiliar with investigative standards. Over time, this gap between official restraint and public curiosity would widen. The Navy's investigation was not designed to satisfy myth or narrative. It was designed to improve safety and accountability. Within that scope, it succeeded. Training doctrine evolved, awareness of navigational disorientation increased. The disappearance of Flight 19 became a case study rather than an anomaly. Yet the absence of wreckage ensured that the story would not rest quietly. Without physical closure, the investigation's conclusions existed primarily on paper. They were authoritative but intangible. For families, the findings offered explanation without resolution. For the public, they offered probability without certainty. This tension between evidence and imagination would shape how Flight 19 was remembered. The official investigation closed with professionalism and restraint. It resisted dramatic claims. It acknowledged human limitation. It accepted uncertainty where certainty could not be earned. But history would not stop there. As years passed, the disappearance of Flight 19 would be retold, reframed, and reinterpreted. Facts would blur into folklore. Probability would be replaced by suggestion. A case grounded in aviation analysis would become a cornerstone of something far less disciplined. To understand how that transformation occurred, it is necessary to examine how Flight 19 entered popular culture and how myth gradually eclipsed documented reality. That transformation marks the next phase of the story.
The official investigation into Flight 19 concluded with restraint and uncertainty, grounded in documented evidence and cautious analysis. But outside the boundaries of naval reports and aviation journals, a different process was already underway. In the absence of wreckage and definitive answers, the story of Flight 19 began to change, not through new facts, but through repetition, simplification, and speculation. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, shaped by media coverage, popular writing, and a public appetite for explanation that exceeded what the evidence could provide. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, newspapers reported Flight 19 as a tragic mystery, but one rooted in navigational difficulty and environmental challenge. Early articles focused on the search effort, the loss of the rescue aircraft, and the Navy's ongoing investigation. The tone was sober. Speculation was limited. However, as months passed without resolution, the absence of closure created narrative space. Aviation accidents with recovered wreckage tend to settle into technical explanation. Disappearances do not. They resist finality. They invite imagination, especially when they occur in familiar places under ordinary circumstances. Flight 19 fit that profile perfectly. The waters east of Florida were not remote, they were heavily traveled. The flight had not been secret. The aircraft were modern by the standards of the time, and yet no trace was found. For many outside the aviation community, this absence felt disproportionate to the explanation offered. Into this gap stepped popular writers. In the late 1940s and 1950s, magazines began to revisit the story of Flight 19 with a different emphasis. The language shifted subtly. Navigation error became mysterious confusion. Weather deterioration became sudden and unexplained. The lack of wreckage became vanishing without a trace. These phrases were not technically incorrect, but they reframed the event emotionally. As retellings multiplied, details were sometimes altered or exaggerated. Compass problems were described as complete failure rather than inconsistency. Radio communications were summarized selectively, emphasizing confusion while omitting context. The loss of the rescue aircraft was increasingly linked symbolically to Flight 19, suggesting a shared cause rather than separate incidents. The Atlantic region where Flight 19 disappeared began to acquire a narrative identity. By the mid-20th century, writers started grouping unrelated maritime and aviation incidents occurring in roughly the same geographic area. Ship disappearances, aircraft accidents, and radio failures, some well documented, others poorly sourced, were clustered together under a loose conceptual umbrella. This was the early formation of what would later be called the Bermuda Triangle. Flight 19 became central to this emerging narrative, not because it was unique in aviation history, but because it was adaptable. Its lack of physical evidence made it a blank canvas. Its timing, shortly after World War II, placed it at a moment of cultural transition. Its official classification as unknown was interpreted not as investigative caution, but admission of mystery. Popular accounts began introducing elements not supported by official records. Some claimed that pilots reported their compasses spinning wildly. Others suggested strange atmospheric phenomena or electrical interference. A few accounts implied that the flight vanished suddenly, as if erased, rather than deteriorating gradually over hours. None of these claims appeared in the Navy's transcripts, yet repetition gave them credibility. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Bermuda Triangle had become a recognized concept in popular culture. Books devoted to unexplained phenomena presented Flight 19 as one of their strongest cases. The narrative was now detached from the original investigation and reattached to a broader theme of mystery. Crucially, these works often omitted context. They rarely mentioned that navigation errors were common in overwater training flights. They rarely emphasized the documented weather deterioration. They often ignored the known mechanical vulnerabilities of the PBM Mariner, and they almost never explained how strong currents could disperse wreckage rapidly. Instead, they emphasized coincidence and pattern. The triangle itself was defined loosely, with boundaries that shifted depending on the story being told. Incidents separated by decades and hundreds of miles were grouped together. Events with clear explanations were presented alongside genuine mysteries, creating an impression of cumulative anomaly. Flight 19, because it lacked a confirmed cause, appeared to validate the entire framework. The Navy's conclusion of unknown was frequently misrepresented.
In popular writing, it was portrayed as an admission of bafflement rather than a reflection of evidentiary standards. The distinction between unexplained and unexplainable was blurred. This shift mattered. Once Flight 19 became embedded in the Bermuda Triangle narrative, efforts to reintroduce factual analysis were often dismissed as reductionist or unimaginative. Skeptical explanations were framed as denial rather than clarification. The story escaped its original domain. Media adaptations further amplified the myth. Television programs, radio shows, and later documentaries dramatized the disappearance, often compressing timelines and heightening tension. Radio communications were reenacted with emotional inflection absent from the original transcripts. Weather conditions were portrayed as sudden and violent rather than gradually worsening. These dramatizations were compelling, but they were not investigative. They prioritized mystery over accuracy. As the Bermuda Triangle entered popular consciousness, it became a catch-all explanation for disappearance. The ocean was no longer simply vast and dangerous, it was framed as anomalous. Normal risks were recast as evidence of something hidden. Flight 19's role in this transformation was foundational. It provided a narrative of modern technology failing inexplicably in a familiar place. That image resonated deeply in a society grappling with rapid technological change. If trained pilots could vanish near home, what else might be vulnerable? This resonance explains why Flight 19 persists in cultural memory long after many other aviation accidents have faded. Yet, when stripped of myth, the documented facts remain consistent and grounded. The flight did not vanish suddenly, it became lost gradually. The pilots communicated continuously. Weather and navigation challenges escalated. Fuel exhaustion became inevitable. There is no verified evidence of supernatural forces, spatial anomalies, or unknown energies. The Bermuda Triangle narrative did not arise from discovery. It arose from accumulation of stories, retellings, and reinterpretations layered over time. This does not diminish the tragedy of Flight 19. If anything, it obscures it. The men who vanished were not victims of mystery. They were victims of a chain of human and environmental factors that aviation seeks constantly to understand and mitigate. Turning their disappearance into a legend risks detaching it from the lessons it offers. Modern historians and aviation experts have worked to disentangle Flight 19 from the mythology surrounding it. By returning to original documents, they have reconstructed a narrative rooted in evidence rather than suggestion. This work has not erased public fascination, but it has clarified what Flight 19 was and what it was not. It was not proof of a supernatural region. It was not an isolated anomaly. It was a case study in how uncertainty, when uncorrected, can become fatal. Understanding this distinction is essential as the story moves into the present. Modern analysis does not seek to diminish mystery for its own sake. It seeks to replace myth with understanding and speculation with probability.
The next chapter examines how contemporary experts interpret Flight 19 today. What advances in navigation, meteorology, and human factors analysis reveal about what most likely happened once the radios fell silent? In that analysis, the disappearance does not become smaller, it becomes clearer. Decades after the disappearance of Flight 19, the case continues to attract attention, not because new evidence has emerged, but because modern analytical tools allow old evidence to be understood with greater clarity. Aviation historians, navigational experts, meteorologists, and human factors specialists have revisited the documented facts with the benefit of hindsight and technological advancement. Their conclusions are measured, probabilistic, and grounded in known aviation science. There is no single modern theory presented as absolute truth. Instead, there is convergence. Most experts agree that Flight 19's disappearance can be explained without invoking unknown forces or extraordinary phenomena. The explanation lies in the interaction between navigational error, environmental conditions, and human cognition under uncertainty. The first pillar of modern analysis is navigational error. Dead reckoning navigation, the primary method used by Flight 19, is inherently vulnerable to cumulative drift. Small errors in heading, wind estimation, or timekeeping compound over distance. Over land, such errors are often corrected visually. Over open water, they can persist unnoticed. Modern simulations of Flight 19's planned route, incorporating known wind data from December 5, 1945, demonstrate how an eastward leg followed by a misinterpreted turn could place the aircraft significantly off course without immediate visual confirmation. If the pilots believed they were over the Florida Keys when they were not, their subsequent decisions would logically but incorrectly steer them farther from land. Magnetic variation is also central to modern understanding. The region east of Florida exhibits complex magnetic variation, meaning that magnetic north does not align consistently with true north. In 1945, this variation was known but not always fully integrated into training practice. Compasses calibrated without precise adjustment for variation could produce readings that appeared inconsistent, particularly when pilots expected alignment with visual cues that were absent. Modern experts note that if the instructor's compass appeared unreliable while others differed slightly, the lack of consensus would undermine confidence in all instruments. Once trust in instruments erodes, pilots rely more heavily on mental models and assumptions, increasing the risk of persistent error. Human factors analysis provides another crucial lens. Pilots operate within cognitive frameworks shaped by expectation. When reality deviates from appearance, this process, known as cognitive anchoring, can cause individuals to commit to an initial interpretation even when contradictory evidence appears. In Flight 19's case, the belief that the flight was over the Florida Keys became an anchor. Subsequent observations were interpreted to support that belief. The absence of land was rationalized. Compass discrepancies were attributed to malfunction rather than mislocation. Modern aviation psychology recognizes this pattern as a common precursor to controlled flight into terrain or fuel exhaustion incidents. It is not a failure of intelligence or training. It is a feature of human cognition under stress. The role of authority further shaped outcomes. In training environments, students defer to instructors even when they harbor doubts. This deference is functional under normal conditions, but can become hazardous when the instructor's judgment is compromised by uncertainty. Modern experts emphasize the importance of crew resource management, a concept not formalized in 1945. Crew resource management encourages shared decision-making, open challenge, and cross-verification regardless of rank. Had such principles been institutionalized at the time, student pilots might have exerted greater influence over course correction. Weather analysis also supports conventional explanations. Meteorological records confirm that weather conditions deteriorated throughout the afternoon and evening of December 5th. Cloud cover increased, winds shifted, and visibility declined. These factors would have disrupted visual navigation and complicated dead reckoning calculations. Modern models show that even moderate wind shifts can significantly alter ground track over long distances. Without accurate real-time wind data, pilots could underestimate drift and overestimate progress toward land. The absence of wreckage is often cited as evidence of anomaly, but modern oceanographic analysis offers a plausible explanation. The Atlantic in the region of Flight 19's disappearance is deep, with strong currents capable of dispersing debris rapidly. Aircraft that ditch or crash into rough seas can sink quickly, especially if they remain largely intact. Floating debris, if any, may travel far from the crash site or sink before detection. The search operation, while massive, was constrained by the technology of the time. Aerial observation relied on visual spotting. Sonar and satellite tracking did not exist. Night operations further reduced detection probability.
Modern experts note that even today, aircraft can be lost at sea without recovery, despite advanced technology. The disappearance of the PBM Mariner rescue aircraft is also understood more clearly through modern analysis. Its sudden explosion aligns with documented fuel system vulnerabilities and witness accounts. There is no need to link its loss to Flight 19's navigational difficulties. Together, these analyses form a coherent picture. Flight 19 likely became lost due to navigational misinterpretation, compounded by magnetic variation and deteriorating weather. Fuel exhaustion forced ditching in rough seas after dark. The aircraft sank, leaving little recoverable evidence. This explanation does not provide emotional closure, but it does provide technical coherence. Modern experts are careful to emphasize probability rather than certainty. Without wreckage, definitive confirmation remains impossible. However, the convergence of evidence across disciplines makes alternative explanations increasingly unnecessary. Importantly, modern analysis also reframes Flight 19 as a learning case. The disappearance contributed indirectly to advancements in aviation safety. Emphasis on crew resource management, improved navigation aids, standardized emergency declaration protocols, and enhanced search and rescue coordination all address vulnerabilities highlighted by cases like Flight 19. In this sense, the loss had lasting impact beyond tragedy. Flight 19 remains compelling not because it defies explanation, but because it demonstrates how thin the margin between routine and disaster can be. It reveals how experienced individuals, operating within accepted procedures, can still be overwhelmed by ambiguity. Modern experts reject the notion that the case represents an unsolved mystery in the supernatural sense. They see it as a complex but comprehensible sequence of events shaped by human and environmental factors. Yet they also acknowledge what cannot be recovered. Without physical evidence, the exact timing, order, and circumstances of the final moments will remain unknown. Which aircraft ditched first, whether any crew survived initial impact, how long they endured afterward. These questions remain unanswered. This uncertainty is not an invitation to myth. It is a reminder of the limits of knowledge. Flight 19 occupies a space between documentation and absence. Modern analysis narrows that space, but it cannot eliminate it entirely. As the story reaches its conclusion, the focus shifts away from explanation and toward reflection. The disappearance of Flight 19 is not only a case study in aviation error, it is a human story defined by loss, unanswered questions, and the enduring power of the sea and sky. That legacy, shaped by both fact and silence, is where the story ends.
Flight 19 did not become history in a single moment. It became history through absence, through unanswered questions, through the quiet persistence of a name that refused to fade because there was nothing concrete to replace it. On December 5, 1945, 14 men boarded 5 aircraft, believing they were participating in a routine exercise. 13 more took off hours later, believing they were flying toward rescue. None returned. What remains is not a wreckage field, not a final report that closes every gap, but a legacy shaped by loss and restraint. The enduring power of the Flight 19 story lies not in mystery, but in vulnerability. It reminds us that aviation, even when governed by discipline and experience, exists within environments that do not negotiate. The sky and the sea are indifferent to preparation. They do not respond to confidence or intention. They respond only to physics, weather, and time. For the families of the missing, Flight 19 never truly ended. Without remains to bury or a confirmed site to visit, grief became abstract and ongoing. The men were not definitively gone in the way war casualties often are. They were missing, presumed dead but never found. That distinction matters. It shapes memory differently. It creates a space where hope and acceptance coexist uncomfortably. Letters stop arriving, but questions persist.
Time moves forward everywhere except where the loss occurred. Within the U.S. Navy, Flight 19 became a quiet reference point, not a scandal, not a failure to be hidden, but a lesson to be absorbed. Training doctrine evolved, emphasis on navigation verification increased, emergency declaration thresholds were clarified. Later generations of pilots learned, often without knowing the origin, from the consequences of December 1945. This is how institutional memory works, not through myth, but through adjustment. Flight 19 also occupies a unique place in American cultural memory. Its transformation into legend says less about the event itself and more about human discomfort with uncertainty. We seek meaning where evidence ends. We prefer extraordinary explanations to unresolved probability. But the truth of Flight 19 does not need embellishment. It is already profound. A group of trained aviators became lost not because they were reckless, but because they were human. They trusted procedures that had worked before. They interpreted information through expectation. They delayed irreversible decisions in the hope that clarity would arrive. It did not. This pattern is not unique to Flight 19. It appears across aviation history, maritime disasters, and exploration tragedies. What makes Flight 19 distinct is that it happened not because it happened, but that nothing visible remained. The ocean erased the evidence efficiently. That erasure has allowed myth to grow, but it has also preserved the dignity of the event. Without wreckage to sensationalize, the story remains anchored in voices, documents, and professional analysis. It asks difficult questions without offering spectacle. How much uncertainty can trained individuals tolerate before decisiveness becomes impossible? How do authority structures function when leaders are unsure? How do environments strip away the cues we rely on most? Flight 19 offers no dramatic final image, no explosion recorded, no crash photographed, no last words preserved in clarity. Its ending is silence, and that silence is honest. The Atlantic has claimed countless aircraft and vessels before and since. Most are not remembered. Flight 19 is remembered because it sits at the intersection of confidence and humility, of modern capability and ancient risk. It occurred just as a nation believed it had mastered the sky. It reminded us that mastery is conditional. Today, aircraft navigate with satellite guidance, digital displays, and constant communication. Yet disappearances still occur, wreckage is still sometimes unrecovered. The limits revealed by Flight 19 have not vanished, they have only shifted. This is why the story endures, not because it defies explanation, but because it resists closure. Flight 19 does not ask to be solved as a puzzle. It asks to be understood as a human event, shaped by environment, judgment, and timing. It asks to be remembered not as a legend, but as loss. 14 men from Flight 19, 13 from the rescue aircraft, 27 lives. Their names are etched into naval history not because of how they died, but because of how completely they vanished from the physical world. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, beyond recovery and confirmation, the remnants of their aircraft rest unseen. The sky carried them outward. The sea received them. And history was left with questions that no longer demand answers to remain meaningful. The value of remembering Flight 19 lies not in resolving every uncertainty, but in honoring the reality of what happened when routine met risk and confidence met the nature's indifference. It is a story that cautions against arrogance, respects uncertainty, and recognizes the cost of assuming control where none exists. Flight 19 is not a legend of mystery. It is a record of humanity's limits, and it deserves to be remembered that way. Share this story. Remember their names, because somewhere beneath the waves and the sky they vanished into, the truth about Flight 19 still waits.